Ayin Beis, Volume 1, we're up to Chapter 82, page 155, Kuf Nun Hey, the middle of the Sukkos Maimer 21, Discourse 21, which the Friedrich Rebbe summarizes as being Ribu Yemid Be'er Pnimi V'Kol Shkem Be'er Makif. The quantitative difference in immanent energy and definitely in transcendent energy. So let's sum up where we're at. The plot is thickening. Very thick. As we discussed and summarized, the whole Ayin Beis, at least to this point, is discussing essentially two types of energy: transcendent energy and immanent energy. What's called in Chassidus and Kabbalah, makif, igulim, sevav kalalman, keser, rotzen. It's all, for practical purposes, synonymous in the broad discussion. Obviously, when you break it down, each has specific, makif has a certain meaning. It could be makif klali, keser has different levels, and so on. And then there's immanent energy, otherwise known as pnimi, or iris pnimim, mamala kalalman, koiches pnimim, internal faculties, integrated circuits, as we said. Yesher, kav. So if that's eagle, this is yesher. That's sevav, this is mamala. That's keser, these are the 10 spheres. The whole Hemshel began with keser. The Hemshel begins, B'shar Shigdimu, that's the name of the Hemshel. Yisrael, Nasil and Nishma, is the Eibush to God, wove for them, bound for them, ksarim, crowns. What is the meaning of crowns? That's the initial opening question. And from there he went to keser being rotzen. It's the desire, it's the first interface. And the key to understanding transcendent immanent energy is interface. Is the interface between the divine and existence. So, to understand the first step of the interface, which means that atzmus, the etzem, the essence, and the same thing in the example of human beings, the first step to connect to a relationship with something is desiring it. There's no will, there's no way. You're not interested, there's no one to talk to. Even in counsel coupling, and people that say, have fallen apart, who loved each other once. And you say to them, are you interested in coming together? There's no interest, there's nothing to talk about, even if they're capable. Because then there's no desire, there's no will to do so. This, as he said, is called keser or rotzen. We're not getting down to the levels of rotzen. The initial desire, the details of the desire, that comes later. To understand that step of the interface, the Rebbe Rashabs goes back and let's understand the structure first. So you can work two ways. You can understand it from God's perspective, God's mind creating, or you can go back to the structure and deconstruct and come to realize what God's intentions is through His structure. So really, to understand makif, he said, let's first discuss pnimi, which makes total sense. Because it's, number one, it's easier to relate to. Number two, you need to understand them both anyway. So 56 chapters are dedicated essentially to Eris Pnimim. I'm not going to go through all the details that we've done here day after day, class after class. From the Eris Pnimim, Eris and Kalim, their structure is symbiotic. They relate to each other, they're tailored to each other. Not only the Kalim have structure, but also the Air has structure, and all the different proofs of it. Then he went to the root of Eris, is the hidden spheres, God's desire for structure. However you twist and turn, he discussed immanent energy in so many different ways. Obviously, it's not exhausted because it's basically the building blocks of existence. And then in chapter 56 and on, he went and said, that's all immanent energy, Er Pnimi. Now let's return to the world of Er Makif, the keser, and discuss and start this transcendence. The first distinction is between rotzen and koiches. Exactly that, the desire and the faculties. The faculties, as we said, are the instruments. The desire is the driving force. Now, I'm not going through the details. I'm just doing a sweeping summary here. And then he went to the discussion of Eir and Shefa. Again, similar to Makif and Pnimi. Eir is more agent of the source. Shefa is more related to the recipient. There's more relationship. And both are constantly necessary. And after that, he went into a discussion, okay, so what exactly is transcendence then? So it's transcendence, on one hand, is above existence. It's not immanent energy, clearly not. Fundamentally different. So he went to a discussion that on one hand, transcendence is beyond it all. But on the other hand, it is the transcendence of this structure. We're not talking about Atzmus that's completely removed and apart. So he's started discussing that Makiv doesn't have his chalkus. Those were the words. His chalkus literally means division. It literally means separation. It means separate, distinct levels, distinction. But in a broader sense, his chalkus, as he made it clear, is structure. It's the definition of structure. A structure means there's chalkus. When there's no distinct entities, there's no structure, no infrastructure. So Pnimi is all structure. The whole thing is about structure. Like he made it very clear. If there was no reason if God did not need existence, there'd be no spheres. You don't need spheres if you don't need for a structure. That's structure. But as we all know, it doesn't begin and end with a structure. The structure is the platform, is the product. It begins with who wants the structure, what's the purpose of the structure. Now you're getting into the transcendent dimension. So it goes the whole discussion, 20 chapters. This is from 59 to 79, which is discussing that transcendence on one hand is this removed entity, but on the other hand, we see transcendence. There's makifim, there's levels in makifim. It's not just a transcendent desire. There's his book Tahiri Allah, Tahiri Tata, the makifim klolim of before the tzimtzum and the makifim kloli after the tzimtzum. This is the macrocosmic transcendent forces. Then there's makifim pratim, keser of Atzilus and keser of Bria and Yitzir and Asiya. So you can't just make a statement. Now, obviously, he's not contradicting himself. He's going deeper into that transcendence. Despite its so-called transcendent quality and it's removed, is commensurate to the thing it is transcending. Meaning, each world, or each dimension, or even Makiv Kloli, has a type of relationship. But it's a relationship, as he brought from Tanya, Perik Memchez, that save of Klama doesn't mean it's save of out there. It's within, but it's not revealed. It's not conscious. So now, obviously, this brings us to a much deeper understanding and much more complicated, because now you're saying it's in and it's not in. So 20 chapters, he discussed the impact of transcendence on immanence, and went back and forth in discussing how each level impacts the structure, but it's not of the structure, as we said, out of the system, but relating to the system. And this is critical, because this is where the whole dynamic takes place of the interface. If we don't have air makif, we are stuck in an air bubble. We have a glass ceiling of our structure. We're never getting out of the structure. It is Er Makiv that introduces the elements of faith, like he said, Mesiras Nefesh, deeper love. Now Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, when a person cries, says a person whose soul is not complete if you don't cry, and says, where is that coming from? It's coming from transcendence, from transcendent forces. If we're in the structure, you can be a happy human being, function, and do what God wants, like a slave serves a master. Is the transcendence that introduces dimensions to reality that is outside of the structure, but is doing it in a commensurate way to the structure. So there's 20 chapters till 79 really discussed the relationship between transcendence and immanence. But then you go to chapter 79. This is a key. I'm pointing out special, we'll call it pivotal or milestone chapters. Chapters that are called junctures, where he returns to the subject matter. Because remember, it's a flow, right? So the interfaces in Ayin Beis itself. So chapter 79 is a key interface, as is 59. Because in chapter 79 he goes back and says, what does he say? B'chol zeh, 20 chapters he means. Hagam shenim shakasu yakasu, for each world, still, qualitatively, it retains a separation, it's separate. And here is where he goes and says, so even though it has different impact, and it has a different relationship with different worlds, but fundamentally, its personality, its muhus, its identity, is of a different quality. And all ksarim are connected to one another. So in immanent energy, in other words, he's saying even the relationship of transcendence to structure is different than the structure's relationship with each other. In the structure, the first point he made, he said, for example, there's a qualitative difference between chochma of Asiya and chochma of Atzilus. He gave the example of a craftsman, whether it's in art or in, what do we call it, embroidery, right, rikum, and chochma of Atzilus, which is more abstract philosophical ideas. That distinction, that qualitative distinction, doesn't exist in Ratzon. A Ratzon for Yasiyah and a Ratzon for Atzilus are rooted in the same Ratzon, desire. And one can graduate to the other, as he made it clear. So that's the first key distinction. So even though we have levels of kesarim, as he said, the key thing to know is that they all are of the same substance, same quality. And I gave the example, which I think is a good example, and I think is going to be very relevant because I'm going to use it now to elaborate further, is think of it like department heads. Craftsmen, well I use craftsmen, workers, meaning the 10 spheres that are instruments, their job is to do their job. Chesed is not, business is not to do chochma. And chochma is not to do bina. They interact with each other, there's Iskalus, we're not getting into that right now. But they're different, their function is their function. That's the whole idea of immanence. Structure means structure. Hischalkus, real hischalkus. What about the department head? What about the nervous system, the nerves that are telling chochma what to do or bina what to do? The rotzen. The keser of chochma, the keser of bina, or the keser of Atzilus and the keser of bria. They are not quite as different. It's true, each one of them is informing, this is a supervisor of chochma, this is a supervisor, but their supervising element qualitatively they're very similar. They go to meetings of supervisor meetings, where chochma and bina are not invited to those meetings. It's a different meeting, because there it's a meeting of strategy, and they all connect to the original rotzen. Their job is to fulfill the desire of the soul. Whether it's a chochma desire, whether it's manifest a chochma bina. Chochma bina, you don't want them in that strategy discussion, because chochma bina have to do their job. They shouldn't be busy thinking about the big picture. Now, of course, at the end of the day, chochma bina are informed by it, and being that it's all coming from one divine source, immanence receives from the transcendence. But right now we're talking about the distinction between the two. So when a brainstorm session is determined in the Ratzon, we're going to build this building, you don't want chochma coming and going back to the drawing board and saying, hey, 1 second, I got to know what you're... No, that the desire is already determined. Now it's time to implement. Now it's time to create art. We're not going back that the artist could have done different types of art, or the artist is still in his theory, or it's still in the Lifnei Tzimtzum and all those, what we spoke about, the different. But so there's a commonality between each department head, or supervisor, whatever you want to call it, between each desire, which is just another word, I'm just using it as an example. There's a qualitative relationship they have that is of different. So that's why the craftsman will never become the philosopher. It's two different types of chochma v'asiyah, chochma v'atzilus. But the desire that shapes the chochma of craft, and the desire that shapes the chochma of abstract thinking, or we call it seichel be'etzem, chochma be'etzem. There, it's like we spoke about there, it's like the desire to throw a stone, or the desire to sit and concentrate on learning. From a desire point of view, it's all desire. What difference does it make? Okay, that was point number one. So there's this qualitative similarity between all kesarim, between all transcendent. But then in chapter 80, he returns now to a question. Okay, now we understand how there's different levels of keser, different makifim, different levels. But then in Etz Chaim he says that the 10 spheres in the igulim themselves. So now he's going, the igulim themselves, the makifim, the transcendent energies have actually 10 spheres, which is awfully similar to the word 10 spheres that we define with immanence. So suddenly it's like saying, the whole point of 10 spheres, as he said earlier, is to define structure. So if you say the kesarim don't have spheres, so each keser is a supervisor for that world. But now you're telling me the supervisor has 10 spheres. That means that the supervisor, the rotzen, is made up of structure. That's what it means. Spheres is structure. That's clear that he said before. So, not that it's not obviously he's going to answer the question, but it seems that's why he says the seisa contradicts. The point was, no, that rotzen doesn't have structure. And it informs structure, it's commensurate to it, it relates to it, because remember, every supervisor does speak to his group, to his team, according to what they need. But now you're telling me there's actually spheres there's actually structure in the place you just said there's no structure. Or using the lotion he's saying, in a place of which he's saying there's ischalkus in igulim. So why are we saying till now there's no ischalkus? So obviously we can speculate, because he's great. So he answers, this is chapter 80, his answer briefly is, and it definitely could be understood from what was said earlier. His answer is that this structure, the 10 spheres in Makifim, the 10 spheres in Pnimim are not the same, basically. Yeah, we're using the same 10 spheres, and he's going to discuss this later more at length. But the difference is, here in the transcendent level, all it is a matter of quantity. When you say chochma bina of igulim, you're basically saying the same quality. Talk about the supervisor. This department head is giving a different measure flow. The flow is of a different measure in different levels. That's what he's saying. And this distinction of the flow is only quantitative, meaning more and less. It's not a qualitative difference. It's of the same quality. It's the same energy. We call it transcendent energy. Just a question of measure. That's the basic point. And then he's going to continue and say, this measure, however, is not what defines structure. Because you could say, okay, what did you achieve by saying this? You achieve by saying it that it's fine, quality the same, quantity different. But that's still structure, quantity. Why is that? What makes it so fine? Since the second point is that quantity does not define structure, quality defines structure.
That's what he spoke about.
Qualitative difference defines structure.
That's what he was so adamant about explaining that chochma and bina are differently.
Yeah. And then he continues the same adamance here. Yeah.
That doesn't define structure.
Yeah. Exactly. That now you understand because he goes back to it.
Is that why he tried so hard to chapters to explain?
Yeah. Now, then he throws into the equation, before I go further into this distinction, there's another element where we see so-called distinctions, his chalkus, in Makifim. And that is not only are there 10 spheres in Makifim, but each sphere itself, each eagle, has a mile and a mata, has a higher point and a lower point. I mean, physically, it's like you look at a circle, there's the tops of the circle, the bottom of the circle. Even though, in other places, we speak clearly that circle does not have a top and bottom. But here he says, he brings it, and he brings where it says in Chassidus, I quoted the Kiyah Mitzvah Zeis from the Alter Rebbe, from Tovkuf Samach Vov, and the Rebbe Marash elaborates on this at length, that we see it in the context of Tikkun Milui Hapgamim, Tikkun Hapgamim, basically repairing wounds, repairing blemishes, repairing something that has been spiritually infected. Talk about a spiritual infection, like a regular infection, requires imminent energy of the faculties is not enough. The regular blood flow and the regular so-called resources of the body's resources is not enough to create healing. Healing needs a surge. It needs a power from elsewhere. So makif is what creates that power. It's like refuah. So refuah comes from the level of makif in general. So in other words, think of it this way. Well, as long as the body is functioning well, makif remains there as like a so-called protector. But then when there's actual problem, you need to have an additional surge of energy that's outside of the system to come repair the system. Now this makiv has two parts to it. There's two aspects to it. Just like a wound has one that the energy has been drained, and two, as a result, the chitzenim, the negative forces have now begin to fester, and the infection begins to grow. So you need to clean out and get rid of those chitzenim, and take away the energy that they've been weaning and feeding off, more than what their allotted measure. And you need to bring back the healthy energy to get back the flow the way it's a normal way. So what it says in the Maimorim, that's what he quotes, is that the first one comes from the higher part of the makif to clean out the infection. And antiseptic, which is like a stronger type of medicine, is from the higher part of makif, and the returning the erpnimi, the eminent energy, is from the lower part. So we see higher and lower. He makes it very clear, however, that this higher lower is completely quantity, not quality. The quality is the force of makif coming to heal. The specifics is, yes, day one you may need to have stronger antiseptics. You may need to have some stronger medicine to get rid of the what's called the raging disease. Right. And slowly you don't need that much stronger. So if you take medicine for day one, you give someone 3 pills, and day 2 pills. The pill is the qualitative shift. But 2 or 3 or 5 or 100, that's already a matter of quantity. Now, obviously, we have to qualify. Every quantity has some quality to it, because it's doing a job that the less quantity can't do. But you're not talking about a fundamentally new entity. Healing is a new force you're introducing. Again, we're not talking about a healing that comes natural, that doesn't require anything. Even then, the body also goes into overdrive when it needs to heal. It sends all its resources to that place. So clearly you see there's also an abundance. So bottom line is, this is now. Let's go back now to the main topic. But all this are distinctions. But the distinctions, it means like the 10 spheres in the Igulim, but the distinctions are quantitative. And qualitative, they're not. And the key thing now is that quantity doesn't define structure, quality does. And to explain that, he continues in the second half of chapter 80 to explains it with chochma and bina. He explains that chochma and bina, as we discussed earlier, even with immanent energy, quantity is not that significant. In other words, what defines immanent energy structure of the essence spheres is the fundamental difference between chochma and bina, not that bina is diminished chochma. And he goes to explain this by using the other extreme. Yes, when it comes to seichel, bina and chochma have a certain similarity. And they're of the same quality. We're talking now in the seichel part, meaning in the quantity energy part. And there, he explains, bina can actually become like chochma. Not exactly, but it can grow. To the point that it can even have part of the emes of chochma. The nekudas tamtzis, it comes to a summary. And even further than that, he says, even when the bina comes to the depth where you come to get a certain resonance and conviction, the hanocha, like he says, the samtus, it's already outside of its hasaga then. It's not bina anymore. So the relationship between bina, chochma, and seichel, that's a quantitative one. But its real structure is qualitative. Chochma and bina will never meet. Even in Atik, he says, all the way in their root, they're two separate forces. But in quantity, because they're of the same personality, they can meet. You see, what can be confusing here is this sounds very similar to what he said in the previous chapter about transcendence. That keser of Asiya can become keser of Atzilus. Because quality, they're of the same nature. So that's true. That's true. When you talk here, if you're talking here on the level of quantity, they have that element of similarity. But the fact is, chochma and bina are fundamentally two different entities. Where in transcendence, it's not that way. We'll get to that in a moment. So we see that even in immanent energy, the structure is not defined by the quantity, because quantity is just a matter of time, just a matter of more or less. That structure is defined by qualitative difference. And then he goes on, before we get back to Makif, he says, and the same thing, it's all in immanence, yeah. The same thing in chapter 81, he says, in the difference between the Gili and the different levels of Atzilus. When you say that Ein Sof radiates in keser and chochma close up, in bina distance, in Zohar like through a window, and malchus through a hole, he says that's all quantity. You widen the hole, you have the same light, like the window. Nothing changes. You want quality difference, you have to go to Bria. Bria is a different quality than Atzilus. Like he said before, that the chochma of the craftsman is completely different quality than the wisdom of Atzilus, which is the essence of ideas, abstract ideas. Here he says Bria. What does it say in Etz Chaim? It says that the light to Bria has to go through a curtain, mosach. And a curtain is not just like the difference between a hole and a window. A hole and a window is the same light, just less measure. The same sunlight is coming through the hole. You widen the hole, you have the same sun. When you're talking a curtain fundamentally changes the light. It's a qualitative shift, right? Paradigm shift. And as such, even if the light is more intense, it's still on the other side of the curtain will be diffused. So that's a qualitative shift. And that's where the real structure is. But you talk about Ribu and Miyat, and he gave an example of a teacher and a recipient and a student. Different students get different levels of it, but it's the same essential idea. That's why it says La'elim, you should always teach a student derech tzara in a summarized way, That doesn't mean you're giving him less. You're giving him more. Mu'at hamachzak hamaruba, as he says. Concentrated in the transmission is the whole idea. And that's why when he reaches 40, not because at 40 years old he goes back to his teacher and hears new things. That which he heard all these years, at 40 years, he suddenly appreciates because it's embedded in there. So that, in other words, it's basically an issue of kamus. It's an issue of quantity, not quality. If it was quality, it wouldn't happen that way. That means within, embedded, even in the small seichel, even in the hole, is the light of the window, and even more than that. You can climb. So malchus of Atzilus has, and we talk about quantity, has an element that it can climb all the way to chochma. Quality, not, but in quantity, yeah. Whereas Bria, even in quantity, can't. Because Bria, it's a whole different personality. It's not of the same league. And then he goes on and gives one final example before he goes back to Makif of Meichen and Midas. Same thing as Meichen and Midas. Even though Meichen and Midas are two fundamental different entities, which is why he brings it. Because here it's even stronger. Chochma and Bina, you could say they're both at the end of the day Seichel. But Meichen and Midas, we made very clear that Meichen and Midas are very, very separate entities. Midas is Yesh, Hergish Atzmei, you sense yourself. And yet, we're talking again, not natural Midas. We're not talking about the natural tendencies of a person. We're talking about Midas that are born through contemplation. The maturity of Midas, as he puts it. So here, the Midas are informed by the Seichel, and they have within them the entire Seichel. That's what drives them. That's their driving force. That's their energy. And especially once they get mature, they have the Seichel within them. And they're a natural flow with an automatic, spontaneous expression of the maturity of the mind. So even Midas and Meichen have an element in them that is, like he concludes, there's no fundamental structure there, because the Midas really have that, the emotions have the intellect in them. Even though they're of a separate entity. Because in the diminished energy, even if it's diminished, it has concealed in it the entire intensity, ribui, of the whole light and energy there. It's just in a diminished form. And then this is true. This is all now imminent. And then he concludes, Mekolshke, and how much more so is makif. So if we stop right here, before I go further, the second half of this chapter, the end of the chapter of 81, you can basically say that we have like this. In chapter 79, he made it clear that transcendent energy of the same quality, and all the keserim are connected. And the lowest transcendent energy can climb to the highest, whereas in the structure of immanent energy, they cannot. The chochma vasiya is fundamentally different than the chochma of Atzilus. The craftsman and the abstract ideas, the essence of ideas. And then there's a second element, and that which we do talk about, the levels of differences, are all, we'll call superficial to the quality of the subject matter. Even in immanent energy, the levels of ribui, of quantity, of measure, don't define the real structure. So then also in Makif, even though in Igulim you have 10 spheres and each one does its function, nevertheless that's not what defines structure, because when you go to the quality of it, they're all of the same quality. So in other words, qualitatively all Makifim are one. In immanence, qualitatively all the 10 spheres are not one. They're fundamentally different. And secondly, even the element that is quantitative difference in Makifim does not define structure, even on the immanent level. And then he adds a key thing in the end of chapter 81. And that is that even on the level of quantity, because till now you could say, you know what, okay, we got it. That in Pnimi we're saying the real structure is qualitative difference between one level and the next. In Makif you don't have such qualitative differences. You only have a quantity. But as far as quantity goes, you could say the 10 spheres of Makifim are similar to the quantitative difference in premium. You follow what I'm saying? You could make that argument. And here he makes it clear that it's not the case. And this gets into a deeper distinction. In other words, even the quantity, which is not the key defining ingredient of structure, is also not the same. Is also not the same.
Because quantity is quantitative, more or less.
No, so he says why. Because it goes like this. He says two key points. That in the quantity and immanence, when there's less quantity, there's less intensity. It's chalicious, it's weaker. The energy is weaker. And in makif, it's not. Even when there's less, it has the same intensity. In other words, the desire, now we'll go back to the department heads. If you're talking about the function itself, so obviously a worker that's asked to work for an hour, and his investment in his work is more just to polish something up, is not the same type of exertion that the worker who built it. So within immanence, you have very clear distinctions. It's true, you could say this is only quantitative difference. Because they're both, let's say, the person who lays the bricks, and the other person who comes and just polishes it up. You could say that's a quantitative difference. But one is diminished energy is diminished energy. In Ratzon, the desire, the department head, he doesn't really care. He needs both. He needs the polishing and he needs it to be built. He doesn't care how much exertion goes on. From his instructions, the instruction level is the same command, the same interest. He needs both. It doesn't matter to him. And his intensity, if one doesn't do the job, he's going to yell at him just as much as he'll yell at the other one. I'm just using that as an example. Ratzon only cares about is the product. He doesn't care about how much energy is going into it. In immanent energy, weaker energy is actually weaker energy. The Ratzon, when you have a desire to throw a stone, that desire is the same investment as your desire to write a book. Even though you could say, what are you talking about? How could you compare the two? This takes a second, I just throw a stone, and writing a book is going to take me years. That's the faculties at work. The desire is a desire. That's what he wants. Whatever reason. But then he says something which is even, I think, the key to the whole thing.
Isn't it more about Atzmi desire? Like he really wants to. This is his essence.
If you remember, he said remember that when he spoke about, which I'm going to get to in a moment. Let me get to that in a second. Remind me if I don't get it. No, it's a very important point you're making, but I want to say it at the end. I want to just finish what he's saying here, because then I'm going to bring it back to what he said earlier in this whole discussion. It goes like this. So now he says a key line here. That's what I want to bring out. I think there's a key line. I would underline it big time. Here. The Liyah is the klolus inyan er pnimi. Being that the general personality of immanent energy is gili, is kasher gili b'miyat, that defines its personality. Here's the key thing. The reason that in immanence, even quantity has far more impact than the impact in Ratzon, is because it has a different role. In immanence, the goal is to get a structure built. The goal is to fulfill a distinct purpose. So yes, it's true that Bina, or the student, has, even at the beginning of his studies, within the idea, has everything that he'll learn and everything that's in there is embedded. And it's just a matter of time. And it's only quantity. But quantity in immanence is quality. What does this mean? I'm saying my own words of that. What does it mean? Because in immanence, it's very relevant what you see. What's embedded is very nice, but Gili is the key of immanence. Immanence is about Gili. Immanence is about reality. It's not incidental that he's a beginner student. It's not incidental that the teacher is diminishing or using examples to teach him Aleph Beis when Aleph Beis has so much more. It's critical. And that defines the student. You're not going to say, a beginner is really a great scholar in potential, just a matter of time. You don't speak that way. You say like this, a beginner is a beginner. However, within the wisdom, in the derech tzara, in the summary, when you teach him A, B, C, Aleph, Beis, lies all the wisdom that he will ever learn, and when he's 40, he's going to come to realize that. But in immanence, it's important to say, this is a talmid, he's a student, he's not a teacher. If you tell the student, you know what, you're really the teacher, just a matter of 40 years. That's not, first of all, it doesn't elicit respect. You have to zreik moral, the students need to know that they're not on that level yet. And the truth is, in the immanent level, your role is what defines you. Your revealed role is what defines you. This is a critical component. In transcendence, on the other hand, it's not its revelation that defines it. What defines Ratzon is what the source wants. The source wants throw a stone. It wants to polish something. It wants. It doesn't matter. That's what all that matters. So qualitatively, the Ratzon is equal everywhere. We spoke about mitzvahs. When you focus on the kavanah of mitzvahs, each mitzvah has its purpose. When you're eating matzah, you're eating matzah. You're sitting in a sukkah, you're sitting in a sukkah. They're not the same mitzvah. Different time. A shear is a shear. You cannot say, you know what, who really cares if I'm going to eat this much or I'm going to do it for this long and so on. These things matter. You'll say, you know what, that within a person eating a kazayas, a certain measure of food, or doing a mitzvah kedei dashir. Huh? Kedei achilles pas. I was going to say kedei. What? The different expressions that are used. A shear, a measurement that should be like this. Within it lies the whole bligvul of elikus. Very nice. But right now, what we need to know is what the measure is. Even the paradox there, that is that only what was the space of the Aron, it says to not take up space. But only when you built it according to the measure. That's the paradox. It's not like they'll say, you know what, since it's not going to take up space. I'll review what I just said. I don't know where I stopped exactly, whatever. So to go back to the line that I was reviewing, I was going to say this line. So it says like this. The li is the closest inyan er pnimi ubchinas gilui. Being that the closest inyan of er pnimi is to be revealed, kashagili b'miyat. So when the gili, the revelation, is diminished, hagam, even though it has within it concealed all everything in there, you ask Gili will tell you what defines its reality is what you see, not what is hidden inside it. Like I said, the student is a student. You don't say the student is a great scholar and it's just a matter of time. Because as I said, when you talk about the shiurim, when you talk about mitzvahs that have measure, you did the kazayas. Yes, within it lies all the intensity of God's will. You build the Mishkan, you ask Moshe Rabbeinu, the visionary, tells you build the Kalim first because that's the purpose. But the architect has to know exactly what the measures are. Mokum ha'oren eina min amida means that the space didn't occupy space. If you measure the Holy of Holies, once the Oren was there, the Oren had a measurement. It says you measured the Oren and measured. You measured from one wall to the other, it would have measured as if the Oren was not occupying space. It's complete paradox. But the key thing the key fascinating thing is not that it's really the space is an illusion, and the lack of and the not occupying space is reality. They're both reality. The only way to reach the place of Mokum and Eina min amida is when the Oren is built by these measurements. Someone will say, you know what? Since it doesn't occupy space, and God is whatever his paradoxical ways, he can do anything. Who really cares? We'll just hack together a piece of wood and the gold and make a Oren. No, it has to be precise, exactly this. When you do a mitzvah, it has the specific mitzvahs that are connected to a time. Over zmane, over bottle karbone. If the day passes, you can't say, I'm going to put on tefillin tomorrow twice for the day before. It's in that particular time. You could say, what difference does it make? God is b'li. Time takes up space. No, but he created time and he created structure. And immanent energy is all about structure. You cannot compromise that structure. This is a critical component, obviously, in Jewish thinking that is very different than other schools of mysticism. You reach the unity of the light. Who really cares about the structure? But the structure is the whole purpose. If God doesn't want a structure, you don't need the whole thing in the first place. So the structure is absolute. And in the interface, this is the beauty of it. So immanence is defined by the Gilui. So even the quantitative difference in Giluyim is fundamentally different in Er Pnimi than it is in Er Makif. Because in Er Makif, on the other hand, the desire for this level or for that level, from the point of view that when you say, I'm doing a mitzvah, whether that's way, Alta He Shekel, you shouldn't measure Kala Kechamura, the light mitzvah, a lenient mitzvah to a stringent mitzvah, because from the point of view of the Ratzon, it's God's desire. But you cannot come and say, since it's God's desire, then I don't really care what mitzvah to do. Because immanence dictates you do have to know which mitzvahs to do. And within that lies a transcendent element that is an equalizer. So from the perspective of immanence, when the energy is less, it's not a small matter. It defines that entity. Now you're a student, you're not a teacher. Now the energy in a weekday is not the same energy as in a Shabbos. Yom Kippur is a holier day than other days of the year. It's not, they say, potentially every day has a godliness in it. Of course it does. But Yom Kippur is Yom Kippur. You stand up when a Sefer Torah comes into a room. You don't stand up when you bring a table into a room. I say there's godly energy in it, because in immanence there is structure, and structure matters. And now we know this is a matter of halachas and Torah. There's a matter of sometimes life and death. These structures. It's not just a small matter. You'll say, "Oh, I did it this way. By mistake, I made it that way." There's no such thing. Structure is critical. On the makif level, on the other hand, even the qualitative difference, the fact that it's a desire for this mitzvah, a desire for that mitzvah, or it's a desire for this world, or a desire for that world, even though there's a quantitative difference between how the makif of chochma, the spheres of chochma, the 10 spheres we say of igulim, the sphere of the chochma in igulim, and bina, but there the distinction is far less relevant. That's why it says, the intensity, meaning the qualitative force of the desire of the department head, is the same. So to sum up, we basically have here is like this, that immanence and transcendence are fundamentally different levels. The fact that transcendence now has some structure because it has 10 spheres is quantitative. Quantitative does not define the primary structure. And even the level of quantitative of the structure of the immanent is different than the quantitative as it impacts in transcendence. So in every possible way, these are the 10 spheres of immanence and 10 spheres of transcendence are not the same. That's the bottom line. Now you asked me a question, he's not referring to what he said earlier, the difference between Ratzon and the faculties, that it does not nitfus, it doesn't manifest. I think, first of all, he's relying on what we've learned before. I don't think he has to say it, because here, it's really the explanation of that. What I just said, is that exactly the same words? I didn't use those words, but that's the same havana, the same understanding. Because you're basically saying, makifim are not defined by structure. Even when they're communicating with the structure, even when they're Their function is like I said, the strategy room with the main desire. All the keserim are connected in that way. So I think he's saying the same idea, he's just not using the word nitfus. In other words, he could have said technically, and the fact that 10 spheres in Nigulim, but they're not nitfus in it. The reason I think he wouldn't say that is because then what's the point? So why are you telling me there's 10 spheres? You tell me there's 10 spheres and it's not nitfus. So don't say there's spheres. He has to have a more explanation because the spheres are there. There are spheres in there. So he's explaining the spheres are just the quantity of its manifestation, of its presentation, of its transmission. I mean, it's very profound stuff, but I think, thinking about it and you're reviewing it again and again, it becomes clearer and clearer.
Would it really be the desire for spheres?
Hmm?
Really mean the desire for spheres?
That would be only one makiv. That would be the makiv before the tzimtzum. But we're talking about in the igulim as they go down. In Atzilus and in keser and everything, there are 10 spheres in the igulim. There's a called chochma.
Why is one called chochma or the makiv?
I've just been speaking about that for close to 45 minutes.
You said it's a quantitative. Right?
No, it's the supervisor of that department. It's the desire.
Yeah, okay, so that's what I just said. So the desire.
No, not desire for all the spheres. We're talking about but it's called igulim. It's called the spheres of igulim. There's igul hakeser, igul hachochma. There is igul hakeser, there's igul hachochma. No matter how you twist and turn it, even if you say it's a desire for keser, desire for chochma, but keser and chochma are different. So it's different. There's two different circles. One is dedicated to keser, one is dedicated to chochma, one is dedicated to bina.
At the same time, we say there's no qualitative difference. So that's
Qualitative, but quantitative there is. That's the whole point here.
I mean, the desire for keser when it's not qualitatively different. That's
Quantitatively different. There's a different measure of energy going into each one. There's a different measure of energy going into each one.
What causes a different measure of energy? What causes a different measure of energy?
Do you understand the difference in keser of the makiv before the tzimtzum and the makiv after the tzimtzum? Let's start with that. Is that the same thing by you too?
without understanding.
I understand, but you see, there, they have different roles. They have different roles. As soon as something has a different role, the question is that distinct role a quantitative or qualitative distinction, and how relevant is it in the fundamental personality of that entity? That's the question on the table. That's where the real distinction comes. In other words, we've established that makifim have levels. For example, a makif is, let's say you put on a shirt. Someone that's a bigger person has a bigger shirt. There are differences. The levushim, according to the body that they're dressing. Makif of Atzilus, even if it's fundamentally a desire, but it's a desire for a particular section of the existence, whereas let's say makif of Ak is a desire for all of existence. So true, they're all rooted in the original desire. But now, this makif of Atzilus, what is it now? More Atzilus is more of the domain of Atzilus, or is it more belong in the domain of desire? That's the question. And this is relevant, and as I said, the key thing here is Avodah. Remember, this is not an encyclopedia, Shulchan Aruch, code of law, Shulchan Aruch of makifim or pnimim, and just mathematics. The key is to understand all this, as I said earlier, is ground. The only way we can ground this is by us grounding it in our Avodah. It's not a mental exercise. I'm trying to figure out which level. What is the Avodah of this? And then you'll see the whole thing takes on a different picture. The Avodah of this is, we're trying to connect to the divine that's outside of our system. That connection has to have two things. It has to reflect what God wants, which is the source. But it also cannot annihilate our structure. So immanent energy, no problem there. Immanent energy, as I said, is an invisible glass ceiling. You can never get out of the structure. You go as far as you can go, is a perfect structure, exactly as God wants. A perfect piece of art. But if you want to go into the artist's mind, into artist's desire, into more of have a relationship with the artist himself, not just this piece of art that he created, that's where transcendence comes in. Transcendence brings us there. Now the question is like this. Is this just a jump into some transcendent energy and that's that? No. Being that we have a structure, and the structure has to communicate with this transcendence, so transcendence in some way, I can't call it masquerades, but in some way relates to each particular world. Which is why, for example, you do a mitzvah, as I said, every mitzvah has its shear, it has its measurement, when you do it, how you do it, how long you do it for, what is our parameters. Within that lies the whole bligvul, the infinity of God. But how do these two interact? So you have to do it based on the rules of the structure. But there's a transcendence, there's a desire that you do it this particular way. And then there's a desire for general dir b'tachtenim. I want the whole world to be a home for me. So the general desire of the home obviously is very removed from the specific desire for this particular mitzvah. But you want both. So you want to have that the desire for a particular thing identifies with the particular, but also is a bridge to bring you back to the Baal HaRatzon, to the desire of all the desires. Like he says, the Ratzon of all Ratzainus. So you can understand that, therefore, that the transcendence also has levels, but here the levels are far more amorphous. But they're not just all one thing either. That's why this quantity quality is critical. So the key point that he's making here is that there are levels in transcendence, meaning there is a transcendence of Atzilus. Like he said earlier when we said in Birchas Yetzer, we say, and it says, Adenu Zenu is the makif of Atzilus. Tzur Mizgavenu is the makif of Bria, of Neshama. The Neshamas that primarily focus on intellectual service. Then comes Mogin Yeshenu, he says the makif of Yitzira. That gives power, the transcendent power for the Neshamas that primarily focus on their emotional work. And then comes Tzur Mizgavenu. I'm sorry, not Tzur Mizgavenu. Mizgav Ba'adenu is the makif of Asiyah. The Neshama is the souls that do their primary work in action. Remember, I don't know if you were here when we discussed that. Now, you don't want to have, these are three different departments. The souls that work in action, the souls that work with emotion, the souls that work with their minds, are three distinct type of souls, Bria, Tzir, and Asiyah. They're qualitatively different. They're all necessary. There's some things that the Neshamas of Asiyah do and the Neshamas of Bria cannot do. Each have their qualities. It's like Kohanim, Leviim, and Yisraelim. You don't want suddenly the Kohen saying, you know what, let's all be one. The Kohen has to do Kohanim b'duchanam, Leviim, Kohanim b'avadosim, Leviim b'duchanam, Yisrael b'mamadam. They each have their distinct role. And therefore, also the makifim that give them strength have to be a makif that's commensurate. It's like that's the garment that fits that particular world. Now, you go to the strategy room, these desires, on one hand, quantitatively have a different, because their flow of energy is to each level commensurate to it. You can't have Asiyah getting powers from the transcendent forces of Atzilus. Besides the general force that it gives to all neshamas. We're not talking about that.
It gets annihilated, then
it becomes right, and also it's not giving it the ability to work through its. He wanted to elevate it from its level. You know, so on one hand, it has a relationship. So there's a quantitative difference, each desire. But if you ask fundamentally, all the kesarim are one. They all nishtalshul zemezeh. They all come from one, and it's easy for one to go and change. He can become a department head of another one because he's not fundamentally an Asiyah domain. Keser of Asiyah. On one hand, it's a keser of Asiyah, but on the other hand, he's a keser. So it's true. What we're trying to thread here, the needle, is how is it both? How is it both has quantitative difference and qualitative similarity? In immanence, it's the other way around. In immanence, the primary role is structure. It's not. Asiyah is not meant to be Bria Yitzir. It's meant to do its function. and therefore it's meant to do its function, and therefore on that level, like you said, number one is there's qualitative difference between one level and the next. Even the quantity also is very critical. Because even the quantity in Asiya, you could say, yeah, Asiya has diminished energy. But potentially it can reach great heights. But that's not its role. Its role is defined by Gili. We're not interested right now in what you potentially can achieve. Because immanence needs to define a structure. You don't say, potentially the energy is infinite, and therefore we don't have to build the Aron based on a structure. No, right now we're building. And when you build, you have to do it by this measure. That's immanence. So immanence, number one, is fundamentally, it's qualitative difference one level to the next. And number two, even its quantitative difference also weakens it. And that weakening is a key difference in the immanent. On the other hand, the desires of each world, or the keser of each world, the transcendence of each world, it's true. They are dedicated to that world. Because that's what their job is. They're dedicated to be the so-called controller of that particular world, the supervisor, the department head, whatever. But fundamentally, that distinction doesn't really impact them that much. Because fundamentally they are just really agents of the main desire. So you have basically, if you want to talk interface, the makif of each world is the interface between the immanent energy of that world and the makif of the higher worlds. So basically it's like three steps. You start immanent, you travel to the makif of that immanent, and then you reach the makif harachik, that's further, until you go all the way to the source. And this is many, many steps in the ladder. So basically, I mean, in simpler terms, it's like this. You're learning something, you understand it, but then there's some things that remain beyond you. You study more, you climb the ladder, now that's immanent. And now you have a new makif. You don't want to jump right away there, so you're constantly going through these stages. All the makifim have one similarity. It's outside of your structure, and it's leading you to a greater place that is more divine and more reflective of God's desire. But if you said, is there a distinction between the desire for Atzilus, the desire for Bri? Absolutely. Because now we're focusing on this. If you ask, if you say all the desires come together, listen, all the kesarim carrying one, they all have the same, what do we call it, the code. The code is God's desire for existence. So it's, yeah, the same source code. And this is, I mean, as I said, this is essentially what he's saying. So it's true, you could just say it's desire, but it's a lot deeper than that. That's why I said the avoid is necessary here. If you talk technically, you're right. Okay, desire. So, okay, fine. The 10 spheres in the Gulim are simply the desire for chochma, the desire for being, the desire for das. But in avoid, it's a critical component. That step is a critical one. You can't move from here to there. Now, what I know, your next question is going to be, where's chochma stamah fit in, right?
No, I'm just clear of the original question.
Chochma stamah is going to be the interface between the makif of Atzilus, the higher level of makif, and the immanence. So within makifim itself, we're going to have makifim, and within, it's a constant. What were you going to say? Okay.
We see there's a qualitative impact from previewing you.
Qualitative impact?
Yes.
Of what? Of
with the makif, it impacts each world. It impacts the world. Because it's equally mute, even with the same nature. There's some tremendous differences at every level. Describe that.
Look, I alluded earlier. I said in kedusha and holiness in general, quantity is also quality. So obviously, the quantitative difference in makifim is relevant, or else it wouldn't have it. I mean, the fact that we need 10 spheres in agulim is not incidental. There is a role. Yeah. The question, however, is how much does it color and shape the makif? That's really what it comes down to. You see, here, for example, here would be, I don't know if he's going to say it later, but let's go back. Remember Eretz Mitziyarim? He said it's not like tinted glasses, colored glasses, and colorless liquid. The spheres themselves have 10 spheres. In makif, you could argue not like that. In makif, you could say the 10 spheres are like simply colors. That the department heads are right now, so to speak, manifesting in. But they fundamentally remain qualitatively of a different nature. I'm just giving you an example. That may be a key distinction.
The makif would be the colorless liquid.
I'm just using that example. Yeah. In other words, the makif is right now involved on that particular level, but the makif retains its qualitative.
So what's defining them? There's kalim?
There's no kalim there. That's the thing in makifim. What's defining them is what garment, what body they're dressing, what department they're running. That's what defines them. It's almost what defines them actually is what God wants them to do. That's what defines them. I want you to go to Atzilus and you take care of Atzilus today.
Really understand.
Yeah, it's like, yeah. So really,
it's just that
I mean, you could say exactly. Remember, that's why I said. In other words, look, let's put it this way: the greatest craftsman on the world.
that's the difference at all. Yeah.
No, the greatest craftsman in the world of Asiya, right, is lower than. The greatest craftsman of the world of Atzilus is lower than the superintendent, than the supervisor of the lowest world of Asiya. Because he's never going to be a supervisor. You're never going to give him supervision because that's not his strength. Right. His strength is doing his function. Whereas a person who has that type of dedication, she says, you know what, since you headed the small department, now I'm going to put you at the head of this department. Now this doesn't mean, of course in business you could have someone who was once in a department becomes the head of a department. I'm not getting into that. But here, obviously God has it figured out beforehand. It's not like, he has the best department heads doing what they have to do and the best people working in the departments to do what they have to do.
Training school, you raise your ranks.
I think it's a beautiful concept because if you think about it, every community, every business, you need the visionary, you need the executor. I didn't say executioner. Executor. The implementer. I think in a community too. I mean, in communities, if they were healthy, we would have this, what you have, the sheikh of shiftechem and sheikh memecha. You have people who are the minders and you have the people who are the grinders. And this is not about inferior or superior. It's simple roles. God gave people different blessings. And there are people who are brilliant in certain areas and some people brilliant in other areas. That's really a healthy structure. So you can say a person who I've sent you, you were like, you headed a small department, I will not put you as a head of a large department. He understands the idea of not being, remember also the supervisor of the department is usually not good at doing the jobs themselves. They're good at criticizing, basically. Like we said about a consultant. Because it's a castrated expert. That's not what I meant. So next time keser of your department comes and says, I'll tell you something. Listen, don't tell me what to do my job. You supervise. But okay. So, first of all, what time is it? So the question is whether we go even to the next chapter. 10 minutes to what?
10 after 10.
I think I shouldn't go to the next chapter.
A rich chapter.
No, because everyone is rich, but I think what we have here, let me just sum it up. So this will be a good review of transcendence and immanence. I mentioned that the Reb Marash in his Maimer in Anoichi Tofresh Lamed Ches, he asked this question about the spheres of Igulim. He actually is the basis of this whole idea that a makif has a higher part and a lower part. And he says 3 answers to the Igulim. He says number 1 is that the kav, because the Igulim are shaped by the kav, remember the thread is what creates the eagle. It says the thread goes and makes an eagle of keser, chochma, bina. Therefore the Igulim have ma'alamata because of that. His second answer is that it's like a garment. So it's not there's distinction in the makif itself. The distinction is only lefi hanikif, that's what he calls it, not hamakif el lefi hanikif. So since the body is different, so the garment fits. In other words, basically think of it like this. It's one garment that can fit many different, right now you need this, so the garment will be shaped accordingly. If it's a different body, it'll shape accordingly. And then on that he writes with Tzarachian, the Reb Marash, on the second thing. And then the third thing he says, Yeshleimer, that a makif there's 2 levels. There's the makif that's beyond structure and beyond any distinctions, and then there's the makif that is connected to structure. That's what he says there. Being that this is definitely based on those ideas, I think the Rebbe Rashab obviously is taking it a lot further, but he's really explaining all three answers. I mean, there end up being one answer, but it ends up being that there's an element of makif that identifies with the thing that it's surrounding, and there's a part of it that does not. It's really what it comes down to. And again, and that's why I say Aveda. You cannot just talk about this mechanically. You start taking mechanically, okay, keser is here, keser is there, where does it fit? You're talking here a relationship. Transcendence has a relationship with entities, very different than the immanent energies relationship. and it also has something that's not really of a relationship. It's something beyond. And I think the mashal with the Betzal and Moshe is excellent. That fits very well. Because, it doesn't use it, but Betzal is the visionary, and that's why he sees the kavanah, he sees, and Betzal, Moshe, sorry. And Betzal is the implementer and sees this is how you build a structure first. Then you bring Kalim into it. In other words, it's really two, what I want to use, not paths. It's not two paths. It's two parallel tracks of what is necessary to get done. Now, obviously, all this is coming to help us connect the two, because there's plenty more to talk about. You can say, you know what? As I spoke then about a Asiyah Ruchnis, if somebody was aligned just with immanent energy, the way God wants, it's pretty good transcendence right there. Because compared to our lives, which we just do whatever we want, you're aligning yourself to the immanence of Asiyah or Yetzirah or Bria. That's pretty good. Here he's talking even beyond that. He's talking not just aligned to what God wants and chochma bina. In other words, if every worker, not department, every worker was doing their thing, we'd have a pretty good world. He's going even further. He doesn't just want everyone worker doing, he wants it all to be aligned with the department head, the ratzon, the desire, the keser. Right, all the way to the bala ratzon. Because that goes back to that the relationship he wants is all the way through and through. So what's fascinating really is, someone could be practical and say, you know what, most of my life is busy, I'm going to be busy fixing my Eretz premium. What are you giving me about Makif? I'm not even there, I have to just align myself. But on the other hand, let's not forget, because we make mistakes in Pnimi, this goes back to the infection. You need the Makif for healing. So however you twist it, you can't get away from the transcendent supervisor. The supervisor is going to come to your door, because if you're doing your job, you're going to connect to him. And if you're not doing your job, you're definitely going to connect, because he's going to come to repair the situation. He's going to come in and say, hey, call you in and say, what are you doing?
Job evaluation.
I think it's a great way really to look at Makif and Primi almost. It's like having your internal supervisor, and then you have your internal implementer. In a way, like Chodesh Elul, the month we're in now, Tishrei, is when you make a cheshbon nefesh. That's when, once a year you make a calculation, you're the supervisor. You're looking at what did I accomplish, and then comes the implementation. When pak fanante de peklach, when you unpack your the luggage that you gather, the baggage that you, the resources you accumulate in Tishrei. So I think this can definitely be applied to many, many real situations, and that's the key. And I say it again and again and again. To learn this without that aspect of it, if you don't think that way, you're going to hit a wall. Number one, you won't be able to get what he's really saying. Number two, you won't get to the bottom line, which is the purpose of why he's saying it. And I think to apply it to models is fascinating. Because almost even how you make a cheshbon nefesh, I'll give you an application. When you look at your own life, you're accountable for your life. When you look from within the system, you can only see it as a workman sees it. Did I do my job right? A supervisor comes and looks at it from an outside perspective, the transcendent, because it's not invested and not bound to the structure, it can look at it differently. It can have a more objective look, it can have a more broader look, it can see is it aligned with a bigger purpose. So I think this type of Makif Primi, in applying it that way, is a fascinating way of using it to grow as human beings. Okay, let's stop here. So we did a review of transcendence and immanence. We're still at the end of chapter 81, page 155. We shall stop here.